Hello everyone, my name's JoshJrumJrastic, and welcome to another Thoughty2 video. I don't know how to pronounce his name, and that's the best, and as much as I'm willing to try, there you go. That's Thoughty2. It's Thoughty2 here. That's my British accent. Thoughty2. Yeah, it's god-awful. Anyways, today's video, we're watching why everything we know about the Black Death is wrong. I would like to know what I don't know, and what I do know is wrong about the Black Death. Do tell, because I don't know. Do you know? Do you know? Because I don't know. Because apparently what I know is wrong. Anyways, guys, today's video is 20 minutes long. Make sure you have your water with you. Water is very important. My water's down here. And as always, if you enjoy this, consider leaving a like on the video. It'd be very much appreciated. And if you're new here, hi, I'm Josh, and this is what I do. I react to videos, and sometimes I play video games. So if you enjoy that kind of content, consider subscribing and sharing my videos with your friends so that it may grow and we can all watch and play some awesome videos and video games together. If you have any suggestions of any videos you'd like me to watch, go down in my comments below, leave me the link or title to the video, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Anyways, on with the video.
Here, coronavirus has affected the world in ways few of us could have imagined 12 months ago. Toilet roll briefly became the most valuable commodity in the world.
Not really.
International travel was suddenly a thing that only existed in old photo albums. And public hugging became about as socially acceptable as public shagging was in 2019. It's been a completely new experience for all but the oldest people alive today. Global pandemics like this always spark geopolitical tensions.
So that means this is an ad.
But to keep yourself occupied, you can engage in your own spot of geopolitical for free. So-called Asian flu including SARS, MERS, 30 days, so don't miss out. Click the link in the description, choose your country, and fight your way to victory. Many pandemics, including SARS, MERS, Ebola, and TicTok, have hit the human race in recent years, but there's been nothing that's combined the worldwide scale and precipitous death toll we've seen during COVID-19 since the so-called Asian flu epidemic, which struck in the 50s, killing as many as 4 million people around the world. As we're having the chance to witness firsthand, pandemics have the power to bring the world as we know it to a standstill. But as we go further back in time, the impact of global outbreaks only grows. Back in 1918, a new strain of influenza that will come to be known as the Spanish flu infected around 500 million people worldwide. That was about 1/3 of the entire world population at the time. The equivalent of coronavirus infecting 2.5 billion people today. Of those infected with Spanish flu, it's thought around 50 million died. Go back further still to the 16th century and Europeans were flocking to the New World. With them they bought pigs, cows, chickens, citrus fruit, a whole host of new technologies, and smallpox. The indigenous population had never been exposed to this terrible disease, meaning there was no immunity amongst Native Americans. It's estimated that 90% of the population may have been claimed by the disease, which is a big part of the reason much of the New World was considered to be such a wilderness in the early days of European settlement. But probably the deadliest pandemic in human history is the Black Death, which swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa in the Middle Ages between 1346 to 1353. Nobody knows exactly how many lives the Black Death took, but top-end estimates suggest it could have been as many as 200 million. And that's with the global population being a fraction of what it is today. Even with our present unique COVID context, it's pretty hard to imagine what it must have been like for our ancestors. In Paris, for example, 50% of the population was killed, whilst it was 60% in London, and in Florence, 80% of all residents lost their lives to the Black Death, inside just 4 months. In total, as much as 60% of the entire population of Europe died during the pandemic. To put that into perspective, coronavirus has killed around 0.001% of the population in America, one of the worst hit countries globally. I say that not to suggest coronavirus isn't a big deal. It's a huge tragedy, so many lives have been lost to it. But hopefully, it gives us a sense of how incredibly frightening it must have been to be alive during the Black Death, when whole towns and cities were being swallowed whole by disease. In our current pandemic, we understand exactly what coronavirus is, how we catch it, how to slow the spread, apparently, and now, thankfully, how we can stop ourselves from getting it in the first place through vaccination. But in the 14th century, nobody had any idea what was causing the deaths of so many people. One popular theory was that a conjunction of planets was creating a great pestilence in the air, and that really was the best science had to offer at the time. Just imagine if the World Health Organization had come out at the start of the coronavirus pandemic and said, "We aren't completely sure what's causing it, but we think Venus might be up to something." As crazy an explanation as what amounts to planet farts may sound to us, it wasn't like the 14th century's brightest minds had any other way of explaining what was happening. Bacteria wouldn't be discovered for more than 300 years, and viruses 200 years after that. The very idea half the world was being assaulted by a microscopic enemy that killed from the inside out would have sounded insane at the time. Today, we know the Black Death was a global pandemic of the bubonic plague, a deadly disease caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It was identified in 1894 by Alexandre Yersin, a one-time student of Louis Pasteur, the French microbiologist famous for making milk less likely to kill you.
Oh.
Yersinia pestis was transported across the world in the bloodstreams of black rats, whose fleas would pass the disease onto us humans through their bites. That explanation, rats, fleas, humans, death, is probably pretty familiar to you. It appears in textbooks and is taught in schools around the world, so we can safely assume it's accurate, right? Well, as it happens, what exactly caused the Black Death and how it managed to kill off half the people on an entire continent
How did he get this footage?
has been debated in scientific circles for decades. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Because while scientists have believed Yersinia pestis was behind the Black Death ever since Yersin identified it over 100 years ago, surviving records from the time of the Great Pestilence don't really fit with our understanding of bubonic plague at all. As you may know, bubonic plague is still knocking around today. Around 650 cases are reported worldwide each year. But outbreaks from recent history seem to have progressed markedly differently to what was seen during the Black Death. So differently, in fact, that some researchers have suggested the Black Death may not have been caused by bubonic plague at all. The Black Death is still so widely discussed today because of the staggering number of people it killed. But that devastation was only possible thanks to the incredible speed with which disease spreads across countries and continents. And that speed is interesting because, when you think about it, a rat-borne disease should only be able to travel as fast as a rat itself can travel. Sure, one rat could infect many others, and each of those furry plague bombs could scurry off in a different direction, infecting more rats along the way. But at no point would the disease front be travelling faster than an individual rat. And yet, in the space of just a few years, the Black Death spanned the full 10,000 or so kilometres, from China to Portugal and most of the places in between. At its height, the pestilence was known to spread tens of kilometres between towns and villages in a matter of weeks, even days. Unless medieval rats were a hell of a lot sportier than their modern equivalents, that shouldn't have been possible. Of course, in those days, rats did have access to a few speedier modes of transport than their little legs could carry them. Black rats are also known as ship rats, for the very reason they were often found on boats of one kind or another. In fact, the Black Death first reached Europe by sea when 12 Genoese ships arrived in Sicily, full of dead and dying men in 1347. Incidentally, quarantine, a word we've all been using a lot lately, is derived from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. It was first used when ships were required to sit at anchor outside of Venice for 40 days during the Black Death. Anyway, the idea that black rats were like teenagers on their gap year, touring the continent trying to find themselves, merrily spreading the plague all the way, is about as accurate as it sounds. In reality, black rats are actually surprisingly homey types. Most never venture more than 100 meters in any direction from where they were born in their entire lives. So, while some plague-infested rats would no doubt have been able to spread disease over long distances after accidentally hitching rides on ships or horse-drawn carts, for the most part, the spread should have been much more gradual and sporadic. Which is exactly what we saw during 20th century outbreaks of bubonic plague. In India in 1907, for example, one outbreak saw the disease spread less than 100 meters in 6 months. And that was with the addition of trains and a hell of a lot more humans to infect. The only explanation for such incredibly fast and widespread transfer of disease is that we humans were passing it to one another directly, without those ratty middlemen getting involved. But people suffering from bubonic plague aren't typically contagious, and in modern outbreaks, rats and their fleas have always been the primary spreaders. But further evidence rats weren't so involved in the Black Death comes from the sheer range of countries that experienced it. The Great Pestilence killed 25 million people in Asia and North Africa, and infiltrated pretty much the whole of Europe. That included serious outbreaks across Scandinavia, in countries like Iceland and Norway, where black rats aren't even thought to have lived at the time, or at least not outside of port cities. And if there weren't any rats, how could there have been plague? Black rats are often seen as the unofficial villains of the Black Death story, creeping around in the shadows, carrying disease into people's homes in the middle of the night, like some kind of evil four-legged Santa whose presents are all flea-shaped and stuffed full of bacteria that wants to kill you. But as it happens, the rats weren't overly chuffed about the prospect of catching the plague either. You see, bubonic plague is just as fatal to them as it is to us humans. That's actually usually the reason we get infected in the first place. Plague-ridden rats eventually succumb to the disease itself, and their joyriding fleas disembark the corpse en masse to go off in search of something else to eat. And if rats really did spread the plague across entire continents, enough of them must have caught the disease to die in hundreds of millions. But from what we can tell, that wasn't the case at all. In modern outbreaks of plague, you find reports of black rats dropping down dead all over the place, falling from roofs, keeling over in gutters, pretty much piling up in the streets. But surviving reports from the time of the Black Death make no mention of mass rat deaths at all. If there really had been a rat apocalypse alongside the human one, people would presumably have connected the two catastrophes. But rats weren't considered as a possible cause of the Black Death until Yersin's time. For these reasons and others, some people have understandably questioned whether Yersinia pestis and the bubonic plague really did cause the Black Death and other similar plague pandemics in history. Because when you take all the evidence together, things just don't quite seem to add up. You might be wondering if it really matters whether it was the bubonic plague or some other disease that killed hundreds of millions of people in the Middle Ages. It's all just academic, isn't it? Well, not necessarily. Because one theory is that instead of the bubonic plague, The Black Death was caused by a highly infectious and incredibly deadly Ebola-like virus, passed directly from person to person. And if that was the case, it would be very, very bad news. You see, these days, bubonic plague isn't much of a threat to humanity. Yersinia pestis is a kind of bacteria, remember? Which means we can kill it pretty effectively with antibiotics. It's mind-blowing to think a disease that stalked humanity throughout history, causing hundreds of millions of deaths, can now be treated with a ubiquitous drug your GP can prescribe. But I guess that's medical progress for you. Anyway, if the Black Death and other Great Plague pandemics were instead caused by a previously unknown virus, antibiotics wouldn't help at all. And if that virus were to resurface today, we probably wouldn't immediately have a way to cure it. As with coronavirus, we'd have to invent a vaccine. Considering whatever it was that caused the Black Death was clearly incredibly infectious and unbelievably lethal, that's pretty scary, especially in the hyper-connected, overcrowded world we live in today. I should point out the idea the Black Death wasn't caused by the bubonic plague has always been somewhat on the fringes of science. But that changed in 2004, when a study of 5 mass burial sites containing known plague victims turned up no trace of Yersinia pestis whatsoever. The argument for another previously unknown pathogen having caused the Black Death was gathering pace. But just when it was starting to look like we might need to do a lot of very expensive textbook reprinting, a better, more sensitive way to search for traces of the bacteria in long dead skeletons was developed. Using this new technique, Yersinia pestis was found in many mass graves of known plague victims.
All right.
And that pretty much proved the Black Death most likely was a huge outbreak of bubonic plague. But it didn't help us understand why this particular outbreak behaved so differently and spread so much quicker than plague outbreaks today. So what gives? One theory is that an infection usually caused by bubonic plague, known as pneumonic plague, was to blame. Pneumonic plague is a severe infection of the lungs that sometimes presents in people severely ill with bubonic plague. When a plague victim becomes pneumonic, person-to-person transmission is possible via airborne droplets. That would cut rats and fleas out of the equation altogether, which sounds promising, but pneumonic plague occurs only when plague victims are very, very ill, and it kills extremely fast, meaning those suffering from it wouldn't have been able to travel much further than your average rat. Assuming not all cases became pneumonic, and that those that did would have died shortly afterwards, it's unlikely this alone could account for the explosive spread of the Black Death. Another theory that's only come to the fore in the last few years is that whilst rats may be off the hook as the main spreaders of the bubonic plague, fleas probably were still key. But instead of rats, these fleas hitched a ride into our homes on another common household animal.
Cat.
Us.
Oh.
Now, before you go judging your medieval ancestors, remember, in those days, people simply didn't know that personal hygiene was so important. As I've said, suggesting there may be hordes of invisible animals living on and inside us, just waiting to make us ill if we didn't have a bath once a week, would have been enough to get you at best locked up and at worst burnt at the stake. For that reason, human fleas and body lice were popular human companions in the Middle Ages, and when we changed the vector from rat fleas to human ones, suddenly things start to make a lot more sense. After all, humans were indeed present everywhere the plague was, and thanks to continent-spanning trade routes like the Silk Road, no animal covered as much ground in those days as we did. In 2018, a group of scientists used an advanced computer model to simulate the spread of bubonic plague in 9 European cities during the Black Death. and other major plague pandemics. They ran the model 3 times. Once with the disease spread by rats and fleas, once with it spread through the air to simulate pneumonic plague, and once with body lice and human fleas as the spreaders. The simulations showed that the last one was by far the best match. Which means we probably do need to engage in a spot of textbook updating, because whilst it does appear bubonic plague caused the Black Death after all, rats were most likely innocent all along. Thanks for watching. Thanks again to Conflict of Nations for...
I learned something new. I hope you did too. Weird. That's all I gotta say to that. Weird. Anyways, guys, as always, stay strong, everyone. Stay safe. Wear your seatbelt, wear your helmet, wear your mask. Don't point the flashlight behind you. Don't look into haunted mirrors. And as always, have a nice day.